Under the warm, golden light of the African sun, the small village of Camoria thrived in its timeless rhythm, tucked between gentle rolling hills and the winding embrace of a river that had nourished the people for generations. Here the air was filled with the smell of roasting maize and wood smoke, the laughter of children chasing each other barefoot, and the steady heartbeat of drums in the evening. Life in Camoria moved at a pace dictated not by clocks, but by the rising and setting of the sun. In this village lived a young woman named Nia, whose life was as deeply rooted in the soil of her homeland as the ancient baobab tree that stood at the village center. Nia's parents had raised her on values woven into the very fabric of Comorian culture: respect for elders, humility before leaders, and gratitude for the land that sustained them. Her father, Bako, was a quiet, strong man who worked the fields from dawn until dusk, his back bent in service to his family and the earth. Her mother, Safina, was known for her kindness and wisdom, the sort of woman who always seemed to have the right proverb for every situation. Together, they nurtured Nia not only with food and shelter but also with the understanding that honor was a currency more valuable than gold, and that respect for others, especially those in positions of authority, was the foundation of a good life. From a young age, Nia absorbed these lessons deeply. She was a girl of graceful movements and soft words, always quick to help an elder carry water or assist a neighbor with their harvest. Yet her humility was not born from fear or submission. It came from a quiet confidence in her place within the community. She understood that one's dignity was not diminished by bowing. It was a gesture of strength, a deliberate choice to honor another. In Camoria, bowing was more than a simple greeting. It was a language of its own, rich with meaning and nuance. A shallow bow might convey respect between equals, a deeper bow could express gratitude or apology, and the deepest bows, where one bent almost fully at the waist, were reserved for the highest honors, such as when greeting the village chief or paying tribute to ancestors at the sacred grove. This ritual was as old as the village itself, passed down through countless generations. It was an art form, performed with intention, posture, and timing, each movement a reflection of the heart behind it. Nia's bow was known throughout the village for its sincerity. When she greeted the chief during public gatherings, she lowered herself so fully and gracefully that some whispered she bowed as if she were pouring her soul into the earth itself. For Nia, the bow was never an empty gesture. It was her way of offering the best of herself, a sign that she recognized the shared humanity in every person she greeted, no matter their status. Children watched her carefully, imitating her movements when they played in the dusty fields, hoping to capture the same fluid grace. Despite her humble background, Nia was not invisible. Her quiet dignity made her stand out in a world where others might seek attention through loud voices or displays of wealth. There were those in the village who admired her, and others who envied her. Some of the younger women whispered that Nia's bowing was too perfect, that she did it not out of respect but to draw favor from the chief or elders. These jealous murmurs were baseless, but envy rarely needs truth to take root. Nia, however, paid little mind to such whispers. Her days were filled with work, tending the goats, fetching water from the river, helping her mother prepare food for the evening meal. In the early mornings she would kneel by the riverbank, washing her clothes and humming old songs her grandmother had taught her. She had a laugh that bubbled up like the cool spring water from the hills, and when she sang, even the old women in the market seemed to pause and listen. Her life was simple but not without dreams. Though she had no desire for riches, she wished to one day pass on the traditions of Camoria to children of her own. She imagined teaching them how to bow, how to honor the land, and how to walk through life with both humility and strength. The cultural importance of bowing had been tested many times in Camoria's history. In the elders' stories, there were moments when outsiders mocked the gesture, seeing it as a sign of weakness. But the elders always countered that true strength lay in the ability to show honor without fear of losing oneself. Bowing, they explained, was not about lowering oneself to the ground, it was about raising the other person up. It was a shared acknowledgement that the well-being of the community was more important than individual pride. Nia held these teachings close to her heart. She never saw bowing as a burden or a performance for approval. To her, it was as natural as breathing. When she bowed to an elder in the marketplace, it was the same as greeting the sun each morning, with reverence and gratitude. The chief of Camoria, a man named Moel, had always regarded Nia warmly. He appreciated her respectful demeanor, though he rarely spoke to her directly. The village gatherings, held under the massive baobab tree, were occasions where Nia's presence was quietly noted. While others might jostle for position near the chief to be seen or heard, Nia stood at the edge of the crowd, her posture straight, her eyes attentive. When the moment came to greet him, she would step forward without hesitation, bowing deeply, her forehead nearly touching the earth, her hands placed flat against the dusty ground. The elders nodded approvingly, for they recognized the purity of her gesture. Still, her grace did not shield her from the growing undercurrents of resentment. Among those who envied her was a small circle of young women, led by a sharp-tongued rival named Adana. Adana's beauty was often praised and she relished the attention, but Nia's quiet dignity seemed to overshadow her in subtle ways that Adana could not tolerate. To her, Nia's perfect bowing was an act of calculated manipulation, a way of winning the chief's favor without openly competing for it. Over time, Adana's envy grew into bitterness and she began to scheme. Life in the village moved on as it always did, marked by harvest festivals, moonlit dances, and the yearly offering to the river spirits. Nia participated in these events with joy, often helping to decorate the chief's seat with woven mats and fresh flowers. She worked tirelessly yet never sought recognition. She believed that the strength of a village came from each person doing their part without expectation of reward. And yet, her destiny was quietly gathering momentum, like a storm forming beyond the horizon. The rituals she cherished and the humility she embodied would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The bow, which had always been a symbol of respect in her hands, was about to become the center of a conflict that would shake Comoria to its core. But for now, Nia remained blissfully unaware of the storm to come, moving through her days with the same grace that had defined her since childhood, her feet light on the earth, her heart rooted in tradition. The news came on an ordinary morning, when Nia was busy tending to the small vegetable patch behind her family's modest hut. The sun had just crept over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. Her fingers were dark with soil as she pulled stubborn weeds from between the young yam plants, humming an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing. Life in the village moved in slow, predictable rhythms, planting, harvesting, and the gentle pulse of community gatherings. But on this day that rhythm would shatter. From the main road, a distant sound of drums rolled toward the village like thunder. It wasn't the beat used for festivals or weddings, it was the sharp, formal cadence reserved for royal messengers. The sound alone made people pause mid-task. A woman drawing water from the well let the rope slip slightly in her hands. A group of children chasing a goat froze mid-laugh. Even the old men at the edge of the market stopped their game of bow and glanced toward the path. The drums grew louder until at last, a pair of mounted soldiers appeared, their spears catching the sunlight, their cloaks bearing the deep indigo and gold of the royal crest. The horses' hooves kicked up dust as they entered the heart of the village. One of the soldiers dismounted, a scroll in his hand. His eyes scanned the crowd that had gathered. "We are looking for Nia, daughter of Juma," he announced in a voice that carried over the murmur of villagers. Heads turned. Murmurs began to ripple through the air. Nia felt her chest tighten, not in fear exactly but in a kind of startled disbelief. The king's soldiers had no business with someone like her. A young woman known for her quiet ways, her respectful greetings, her long hours at the river washing clothes for her neighbors. Stepping forward hesitantly, she wiped her hands on her skirt, leaving faint smudges of earth. "I am Nia," she said softly. The soldier gave a curt nod and unrolled the scroll. The parchment glistened faintly with a royal seal pressed deep into its surface. "By order of His Majesty the King, Nia, daughter of Juma, is summoned to the royal palace to attend a formal ceremony tomorrow at midday," he read aloud. His voice was clipped and precise, but the words rang like a bell in the silent air. "She is to present herself in the hall of the Golden Throne, where she will offer her greetings to the king." The crowd erupted in murmurs again. Some voices carried awe, "She's been chosen by the king himself." While others carried suspicion, "Why would the king summon a village girl?" Nia's heart pounded. She wanted to ask why, but the soldiers offered no explanation. Instead, they handed her a folded piece of fine cloth, royal blue, embroidered with a simple gold border. "Wear this as a sash," the soldier said. "It will mark you as an honored guest." Without another word, they mounted their horses and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and 100 unasked questions behind them. Her neighbors crowded around. Some touched her arm in congratulations, others simply stared. Old Mama Quito, who had known Nia since birth, took her aside. "Child," she said gravely, "if the king has summoned you, there is purpose in it. You must carry yourself with the dignity of our people. Remember, when you bow to the king, you bow not only for yourself but for all of us." That night, Nia could hardly eat. The boiled cassava and vegetable stew her mother prepared tasted bland on her tongue. She sat by the small fire, staring into the flames, imagining the grandeur of the palace she had only heard of in stories. Her grandmother had described the Hall of the Golden Throne once, speaking of carved ivory columns, vast murals of battles and harvests, and a throne said to be so large it seemed built for a god rather than a man. And tomorrow she would see it with her own eyes. She didn't sleep much. Long before dawn she rose, bathed in cool river water, and carefully braided her hair. Her mother ironed her best dress, simple but clean, dyed the deep red of dried hibiscus petals. When it was time, she tied the royal blue sash across her chest, feeling its weight as more than just cloth. It was a symbol, a summons, perhaps even a test. The journey to the palace took most of the morning. She walked with a small group from her village who had decided to accompany her partway, offering prayers and blessings. As the palace walls came into view, tall, gleaming in the sun, adorned with banners of gold and indigo, Nia felt her stomach tighten again. The gates were guarded by soldiers in polished armor, their spears crossed until she presented her sash. Only then did they let her through, leading her into the sprawling palace grounds where fountains whispered and peacocks wandered freely. Inside, a palace servant guided her through marble corridors lined with statues. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and something sharper. Oil used to polish the throne room floors until they gleamed like still water. At last, the servant stopped before a pair of massive doors inlaid with gold patterns. When these open, you will walk to the center of the hall, stop before the steps of the throne and bow, the servant instructed. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not raise your head until the king bids you. His eyes flicked over her quickly, making sure her sash was straight. The doors swung open with a deep, resonant creak. Nia stepped forward, her sandals making almost no sound on the polished floor. The hall was even more magnificent than she had imagined. Vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of harvest festivals, tall windows spilling sunlight across mosaic tiles. And there, at the far end, elevated on a dais of 3 steps, sat the golden throne itself. The king reclined upon it, draped in silks, his crown catching the light in brilliant flashes. He was flanked by advisors, guards, and court nobles whose eyes followed her every step. Her heart pounded in her ears as she approached the base of the dais. She lowered herself into a bow, her forehead nearly touching the cool tiles. The moment stretched, the hall silent except for the faint rustle of silk from the nobles shifting in their seats. Somewhere in her chest, she carried the weight of her village, the quiet dignity her elders had taught her. She did not know why she had been summoned, but she intended to bow with the fullest measure of respect she could offer. She could feel the king's gaze on her, heavy and unreadable. In that silence, before the moment's strange twist of fate, Nia knew her life was about to change in ways she could not yet see. Under the grand arches of the palace, where gold-painted pillars rose like the trunks of ancient baobab trees, the air was thick with murmurs and perfumed whispers. Courtiers glided across polished marble, their silken robes trailing like streams of color behind them. At first glance, it was a scene of grace and elegance, but beneath the shimmering layers of etiquette, the court was a nest of serpents, and their eyes had already found Nia. Nia had arrived earlier that morning, her simple attire made finer by the delicate embroidery her mother had sewn herself. She had no jewels, no silken cloak, no feathered headdress to mark her as one of influence, yet there was a quiet poise about her that drew notice. For some, it was a curiosity. For others, it was an irritation. They were accustomed to newcomers arriving with bowed heads and lowered eyes, visibly trembling under the weight of the court's grandeur. But Nia's respect was not born of fear, it was born of dignity. And dignity, in a place where power was measured in submission, was dangerous. By mid-morning, the gossip had begun to flow like spilled palm wine. "Who does she think she is?" whispered Lady Sephew, a courtier with robes so heavy they needed 2 handmaidens to arrange them. Her voice was low, but her eyes glinted with sharp malice. "A girl from the river banks, walking in here as though she were carved from ivory herself." "She will stumble," another replied, fanning herself lazily. "They always do." But for some, stumbling was not enough, they wanted her humiliated. Lord Bacco, whose influence in the court was as much a product of cunning as it was of inherited wealth, watched Nia with a thin smile. He had been hoping for a distraction, and here she was, a symbol of something the court despised, someone who did not need their approval to stand tall. "We'll see if that poise lasts," he murmured to a fellow noble, whose grin mirrored his own. That day's ceremony was not merely about greeting the king. It was a carefully staged performance of loyalty, where every bow, every gesture, and every spoken word reinforced the king's supremacy and the courtier's place beneath him. The bow was especially important, it was both tradition and test. Too shallow and one risked being labeled disrespectful. Too deep and one appeared desperate, a dangerous look for those hoping to keep their dignity intact. The plan began to form in whispers and exchanged glances. While Nia's summons to the palace had been a surprise to her, to others it had been an opportunity. They would nudge her, guide her, advise her, until the moment of her bow would become her undoing. If she bowed improperly, the insult would ripple through the court like a struck gong. If she overdid it, they would mock her for years. Either way, she would leave the palace with her reputation in tatters. Lady Sephew was the first to approach Nia, her voice sweetened like tea but carrying the faint sting of condescension. "You must be nervous," she said, tilting her head. "The bow is tricky. If I were you, I'd go very low. The king appreciates thorough respect." Her eyes flickered with something unkind, but Nia only nodded politely, unsure whether to take the advice or not. Later, Lord Baco happened to pass by and added his own counsel. "Not too low," he said with mock seriousness. "If you bow too deeply, you risk looking like a beggar. The king despises desperation." He gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes and moved on. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the palace windows, Nia had received no fewer than a dozen conflicting pieces of advice. Some told her to keep her eyes on the ground. Others insisted she must look up halfway. A few even suggested strange, impossible gestures they claimed were tradition. It was a tangle of contradictions designed to confuse her. In the shadows, the court's lesser attendants, those who swept the floors, carried the trays and lit the lamps, watched with a mix of sympathy and caution. They could see what was happening, but speaking out against the courtiers' games was dangerous. Nia, however, noticed their glances and read the silent warning in their eyes. When evening finally came and the ceremony began, the great hall was filled with light from hundreds of oil lamps. The king's throne stood at the far end, carved from ebony and inlaid with gold. Courtiers lined the path, their faces expectant, waiting for the spectacle they had worked to set in motion. Nia stood at the entrance, her heart steady but her thoughts swirling. She could feel the weight of their eyes, the tension of their smirks, the invisible push for her to fail. But what they didn't understand was that Nia had grown up under a different kind of pressure. The river had taught her balance on slippery stones, the village elders had taught her patience, and her mother had taught her that respect meant nothing if it was not sincere. She would bow, yes, but not as a pawn in their games. Even so, the atmosphere was tightening. Every whisper felt like a thread pulling at the edges of her resolve. The rivals in the court, satisfied that they had spun their web, settled back to watch. The trap had been laid, all that was left was for Nia to walk into it. What they didn't yet realize was that sometimes, the prey they set out to catch has teeth of its own. The palace stood like a jewel carved out of the heart of the earth itself, its walls glimmering under the sunlight with gold leaf patterns and intricate carvings that told the story of the kingdom's long and proud history. It was the first time Nia had ever stepped beyond the village fields and into the capital, and every step toward the throne room felt like walking into the pages of a legend she had only heard in fireside tales. Her bare feet, accustomed to the warm dust of her village, now pressed against cool, polished marble so smooth it reflected the high vaulted ceiling above her. Enormous pillars lined the long hallway that led to the king's chamber, each wrapped in silk banners dyed in deep crimson and royal blue. Torches burned in golden sconces, their flames dancing like restless spirits, casting shifting shadows along the walls. The air inside the palace was scented with frankincense and myrrh, an aroma so rich it seemed to cling to her skin and clothes. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, each belonging to courtiers, guards, and attendants, their gazes sharp and assessing. Some looked at her with simple curiosity, while others wore smirks that hinted at something cruel beneath their courtly masks. Nia was aware of her simple attire, the long woven cloth from her village that marked her origins, but she wore it with pride. It carried the smell of the river breeze and the feel of her grandmother's careful hands. No palace gold could ever replace that. The throne room itself was a masterpiece of grandeur. Its wide floor stretched like an ocean of polished stone, inlaid with swirling designs of gold and obsidian. Tall windows framed with jewel-encrusted borders let in shafts of sunlight that painted the space in hues of amber and silver. At the far end, on a dais of 3 steps, sat the throne, crafted entirely from a single massive block of ebony wood, its back carved into the shape of a lion's roaring head. Every detail gleamed as though polished daily by 100 careful hands. The lion's eyes were inlaid with deep green emeralds, so lifelike that Nia felt as though they were watching her every move. The king, resplendent in flowing robes of gold-threaded silk, sat upon this seat of power. His face was calm but unreadable, a mask of authority that did not betray whether he welcomed or doubted her. 2 guards stood on either side of him, their spears tipped with blades so sharp they seemed to hum in the still air. Behind the throne, a massive tapestry hung from ceiling to floor, depicting the kingdom's most glorious battles, its threads woven with gold so fine that it shimmered like sunlight on water. Nia's heart pounded as she moved forward. Every step felt heavier, as though the weight of the palace's history pressed down on her shoulders. She could hear the shuffling of silk and the faint murmur of whispers from those gathered in the gallery that flanked the throne. These whispers carried a strange mix of curiosity, mockery, and anticipation. She knew why. Word of the courtiers' jealousy had traveled fast. Some people here were waiting, perhaps even hoping for her to make a mistake. Her eyes scanned the faces in the room. Among the richly dressed nobles, she spotted those who had plotted against her earlier, men and women whose finely adorned smiles barely hid the disdain beneath. They spoke in low voices, glancing between each other and back to her as though sharing some silent joke. She could almost feel their hunger for her failure. The air around them seemed to buzz with the energy of their malice. Still, Nia did not falter. She reminded herself of her grandmother's words, "A bow given from the heart is a mirror to the soul. It shows who you are, not who they want you to be." In her village, bowing was not simply a show of obedience, it was an act of respect that flowed from humility, a gesture that acknowledged the spirit of the other person without diminishing one's own worth. But here in the palace, that same gesture carried layers of politics, hierarchy, and power plays she had never needed to consider before. She finally stood before the throne, the great lion looming above her. The polished floor beneath her reflected her own face, calm though her pulse thundered in her ears. For a moment, silence fell over the throne room. The courtiers' whispers faded, replaced by an almost electric stillness as all waited for the village girl to perform her bow before the king. Somewhere in the back of the hall, the faint clang of a dropped ornament echoed, quickly silenced by a reprimanding hiss. Nia inhaled deeply. She could feel the anticipation in the room coil around her like a tightening rope. She was aware of the eyes of the king, the watch of the guards, and the smirks of her enemies. The bow she was about to make was not merely a greeting, it would be a statement, one that could either elevate her dignity or crush her under the weight of courtly judgment. Her fingers brushed the edge of her woven cloth as if drawing strength from the threads. The scent of the palace incense mixed with the memory of her village's open air. She took one more step forward, ready to bend in respect, but with a resolve in her heart that no one in that grand hall could yet see. Under the high golden arches of the throne room, the air was heavy with incense and murmured protocol. Courtiers stood in neat rows, their silks whispering as they shifted to get a better view of the village girl brought into the king's presence. Nia stepped forward, her bare feet making the faintest sound against the polished marble floor. She had practiced her bow all her life, not in grandeur, but in the humble manner her grandmother had taught her. Spine curved in respect, head lowered in reverence, heart open in sincerity. Every step toward the throne felt like walking deeper into a river of watchful eyes, each one measuring her worth. The king sat on his massive carved seat, high above, his robe shimmering with threads of gold. His face was still, unreadable, and Nia's heart raced, but not from fear, it was from the weight of the moment. The hush in the hall was so complete she could hear her own breathing. She reached the final step before the throne, and without hesitation began her bow. Her body folded gracefully, almost touching the cool floor, her hair falling forward in a dark curtain. But before her forehead could meet the tiles, a sharp voice cut the silence. "Stop." The word rang like a slap, but the blow came a second later. A heavy palm struck her across the cheek, the sound sharp and humiliating in the echoing chamber. The force snapped her head to the side. She staggered but did not fall. The sting spread across her face like fire. Gasps rippled through the room. The man who had struck her, an official robed in deep crimson, stood beside her, his eyes gleaming with malice. "This," he said, pointing at her still bowed form, "is mockery." She bows so low as to insult his majesty, as though she were groveling like a beggar rather than showing proper respect. Nia froze, her face burning not just from the slap but from the shame of being accused before the entire court. The murmurs grew louder. Some courtiers covered their mouths in feigned shock, others smirked openly as though they had been waiting for this spectacle. She knew this was the work of jealousy, whispers in the marketplace, resentful eyes following her since the royal summons. Now it had found its stage. She slowly straightened, her hand brushing her cheek. Her gaze lifted, not to meet the official's eyes, he was not worth that, but to steady herself. Her breathing slowed, her spine straightened. She could feel the weight of the king's eyes on her, though his face betrayed nothing. The court official, sensing the attention, exaggerated his bow toward the throne. "Your Majesty," he said smoothly, "forgive my action, but I could not stand by and allow such mockery in your presence." Her bow was too deep, too theatrical, an insult to your dignity. The king's silence was more unnerving than any shout could have been. Nia glanced briefly at the courtiers. She could see the satisfaction in some faces, the unease in others. She wanted to defend herself, to tell the truth of her intent, but tradition dictated that she speak only if addressed. The slap still tingled against her skin, but beneath it, something hotter began to burn. Not humiliation, but the first spark of something unyielding. The official stepped back smugly, clearly believing he had won whatever game he had set in motion. But Nia's mind was already turning, quietly, sharply. The sting on her cheek was only the beginning. She would remember this moment for what it truly was, not a shame to be buried but a line drawn in the sand. The hall remained silent, waiting for the king's verdict, but his lips stayed sealed. Somewhere in the silence, a seed was planted, one that would grow into the moment no one in that hall could have foreseen. The moment her bow would not only reclaim her dignity, but break the very throne before which she now stood. The air in the throne room hung thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Nia stood motionless, the sting of the slap still glowing across her cheek. The crimson-robed official stepped back into place, smug satisfaction radiating from his posture. But before another word could be spoken, a sound shattered the stillness, a deep, splintering groan that seemed to rise from the very bones of the palace. Heads turned toward the throne. The great seat of power, carved from a single block of ebony wood and inlaid with gold, trembled faintly beneath the king. The floor beneath it quivered, almost imperceptibly at first, but enough to send an uneasy ripple through the gathered court. The king shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing in confusion. Then came a sharp, jarring crack, like the sound of a tree splitting in a storm. Gasps erupted as one of the throne's armrests broke clean away, the gold trims snapping like brittle twigs. The king gripped the remaining armrest, but it too gave way under his touch, sending fragments skittering across the marble floor. The deep, resonant snap that followed silenced even the whispers. In an instant the seat itself split down the middle, the crack racing like lightning from the backrest to the base. With a slow, almost surreal inevitability, the two halves of the throne leaned away from each other and collapsed with a thunderous crash. Gold leaf and splinters of black wood scattered in every direction, some pieces sliding across the floor to land at the feet of the stunned courtiers. The king sat stunned on the shattered remains, one knee bent awkwardly as attendants rushed forward to help him stand. The official who had struck Nia took a step back, his face drained of color, as though the breaking throne had somehow been aimed directly at him. All eyes turned almost instinctively toward Nia. She had risen to her full height, the faint redness of the slap still visible, but her face unreadable. The timing was impossible to ignore. The throne had broken the moment she stood. In the old superstitions whispered across the kingdom, such an event was an omen. A throne breaking in the presence of a newcomer meant the old order was faltering, and power was shifting. Murmurs began, low at first, then swelling into waves. "Did you see? It happened as she rose. The spirits are speaking." The king, though visibly shaken, raised a hand for silence. But the silence that fell was not the same as before. It was electric, humming with the invisible weight of meaning. The courtiers' eyes darted between the broken throne and the girl from the village, as if trying to piece together the prophecy they had all heard as children. Nia did not speak. She let the moment stretch, her calmness making the official beside her shift uneasily. She could feel the shift in the room. The same people who moments ago watched her be humiliated were now watching her with something else entirely. A mix of fear, awe, and curiosity. The attendants helped the king to a smaller ceremonial chair nearby, but it was a poor replacement for the grandeur that had just crumbled. The broken halves of the throne still lay scattered like the bones of a fallen giant. And in that fractured silence, Nia knew, whatever power had decided this was her moment, it had just cracked open the palace itself. The throne had barely been cleared from the marble floor before the whispers began to spread like wildfire. By the time Nia was escorted out of the palace gates, the news had already traveled faster than the royal messengers themselves. Servants who had been polishing brass handles swore they had seen the whole thing with their own eyes. Guards who had been posted outside claimed they heard the crash and felt the tremor under their boots. The throne split when she stood, one cook murmured to another as they kneaded bread in the palace kitchens. "No," the other corrected, her voice low but intense, "it split because she stood." By evening, the whispers had left the palace walls and slipped into the winding streets of the capital. At first, the story was just an oddity, a curious mishap at court. But in a kingdom where the people still believed that the spirits of earth and sky spoke through signs, the details began to warp, grow, and take on a different shape. Some said that when Nia rose from her bow, a faint light had shimmered around her, too quick for everyone to see but bright enough to make the gold on the throne burn in the king's eyes. Others claimed they had heard a strange humming, like the low call of a distant drum, moments before the wood gave way. By the time the tale reached the outer villages, it had grown into something far greater. The elders in Nia's own village sat by the fire that night, their faces lined with thought. "It is no accident," one of them said. "The throne has stood for 3 kings and never faltered. For it to break at her rising, the ancestors are speaking." "She was struck before the king," another elder added gravely, "and the spirits will not allow the innocent to be shamed." Children leaned in close to hear, eyes wide, as stories were told of ancient women blessed by the river gods, whose mere presence could crack stone or bend the fates of kings. They began to call her, the one who shakes thrones. Back in the palace, the courtiers were less romantic but no less unsettled. Some feared she might carry a spiritual blessing that could threaten the balance of power. Others suspected witchcraft, that perhaps she had brought a hidden curse into the throne room. The jealous official who had slapped her stayed uncharacteristically quiet, avoiding the gaze of those who remembered his smugness only moments before the collapse. The king himself, though publicly silent, had ordered the royal seer to interpret the omen. For 2 nights, the seer fasted, listening for signs in the wind and the patterns of the stars. When he emerged, his words were carefully measured. "The breaking of the throne means a shadow has fallen over the old seat of power. But where there is a shadow there is also light. The one who rose when the throne fell carries the attention of forces beyond this court." That single statement only deepened the intrigue. Was Nia destined to bring ruin or renewal? Was she chosen by the ancestors or was she their test? When Nia walked through the village market days later, people paused in their bargaining to watch her pass. Some offered quiet greetings, their tone respectful, even reverent. Others kept their distance, as though afraid her mere presence might summon change into their lives. Nia herself said nothing about the rumors. She carried herself as she always had, neither confirming nor denying the strange power people claimed she possessed. But inside she felt the weight of eyes on her, the palace's watchful suspicion, the villagers' quiet hope, and somewhere in between, the hum of something she could not yet name, as though the air itself had decided to follow her. The elders gathered in the village's meeting hut, a circular structure of woven reeds and clay, its roof low enough to make the air inside heavy and still. The smoke from the central fire curled lazily upward, painting the faces of those seated in shifting shadows. Word had already reached them from the capital. The broken throne, the slap before the king, and the strange murmurs of spiritual power. Nia sat on a reed mat in the center, her hands resting in her lap. She had been summoned at dawn, given no time to eat or drink before facing the council. Her stomach churned, not from hunger, but from the knowing that the way they looked at her now was different from before. Elder Kamau, the oldest and most respected voice in the village, leaned forward. His voice was deep and deliberate. "Nia," he began, "the throne of our king has stood for generations. No storm, no war, no fire has broken it. Yet when you stood, it split. There are those who believe this is the work of the ancestors. There are others who fear darker hands." The word darker seemed to cling in the smoke, making the other elders shift uncomfortably. Elder Malika, a woman known for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, did not wait for Nia's reply. "It is not only the throne," she said. "We have all seen her good fortune. How many times has she escaped danger? How often does she find success where others fail? Do you think this is ordinary? Or has she traded something for it?" A murmur rippled through the council. The younger elders exchanged glances, some doubtful, some curious. "She carries herself with respect," countered Elder Zuberi, his tone calm but firm. "We have known her since she was a child. If the ancestors chose to bless her, would that not be an honor to our village?" "Blessing," Malika scoffed. "Or witchcraft. Do you forget the story of Nyasha the weaver? She too claimed innocence until the rains failed and the crops died. Then the truth came, she had bound the spirit of the river to her will." Nia finally spoke, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "I'm no witch. I did not ask for the throne to break, nor did I bring shame to the king. I bowed as custom demands. I rose when I was told. What happened, happened beyond my power." Her words were met with a long silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Elder Kamau studied her, his lined face unreadable. If you speak truth, then the spirits themselves have set their eyes on you. This can be a gift, or a burden. But if you lie, the burden will be heavier than any gift you hope to gain. Another elder, Naima, leaned forward. The palace watches her now. If they suspect her of sorcery, they may call her back, and not for honor. If we turn our backs on her, she will stand alone. And when the palace takes one of our own, they do not always return them. Her words seemed to stir a different kind of unease. The thought of the palace's grip made even Malika fall silent. Kamau raised his hand for quiet. We will not decide today. The ancestors are still speaking and we will listen. But know this, Nia, your steps are no longer your own. Every move you make will be seen, weighed, and remembered. When the meeting ended, Nia stepped out into the daylight, the air cool against her skin after the heaviness of the hut. She could feel the eyes of the villagers who had gathered outside, waiting for news. Some faces softened when they saw her. Others turned away, lips tight. She walked home slowly, each step echoing with the knowledge that she was no longer just Nia of the village. She had become something else, a question, a story, and perhaps, a warning. The royal court gathered in the great hall, its tall wooden pillars carved with scenes of ancient victories and blessings from the gods. The air was thick with tension, for the memory of the throne's collapse still lingered like the echo of a drumbeat. Courtiers, guards, and servants whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking between the empty space where the king's great seat had stood and the dais now draped in ceremonial cloth. The king entered slowly, wearing a plain robe instead of his usual heavy regalia. His gold crown rested lightly on his head, but his face carried the weight of deep thought. The murmurs hushed at once. He walked to the center of the dais where a temporary seat, simple, unadorned, had been placed. He did not sit immediately. Instead, he let his gaze sweep across the hall, resting briefly on Nia, who stood with the other petitioners. Many of you have spoken in fear, the king began, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the hall. Fear of curses, fear of ill omens, fear of change. You say the throne broke because a woman stood before it. You say this is witchcraft. You say the ancestors are displeased. A low murmur rose, but the king lifted his hand and it fell silent. I have considered all these words, he continued. I have prayed to the gods, I have listened to the elders, and I have walked alone through the palace gardens in the hours before dawn. And here is what I have learned. He turned slightly as if speaking to the empty space where the throne had once been. A throne is only wood, however fine its carving. Gold does not make a man wise, and high seats do not make him just. When the throne broke, it was not my crown that cracked, it was my pride. I had begun to believe that respect was something owed to me because of where I sat, not because of how I ruled. The courtiers shifted uneasily. No king had ever spoken such words in living memory. He looked at Nia again, his eyes steady but without anger. You came before me as our customs demand, yet I saw your hesitation and thought it disrespect. I called you forward not to honor you but to remind you of your place. And yet, it was I who needed the reminder. The silence in the hall grew heavier, as if every person were holding their breath. The gods, or perhaps the ancestors, chose to speak in wood and splinters, the king said. They showed me that a ruler who demands respect without giving it will sit upon a seat that cannot bear his weight. A faint gasp came from the crowd. Some bowed their heads, others stared at him in disbelief. So, the king declared, I will not call this a curse, nor will I call for punishment. Nia is guilty of nothing. She will return to her village with my blessing, for she has done what few dare, she has been a mirror to her king. Nia felt her breath catch. She had braced herself for accusations, perhaps even exile, but not this. The king motioned to the master carver. When the throne is remade, it will bear new symbols, not only of power but of humility. And in its design, there will be a carving of a young woman standing before the seat, so that no king after me forgets this lesson. The court erupted into murmurs again, but this time they were tinged with awe. Some praised the king's wisdom, others whispered that he had been softened by superstition. The king finally sat in the plain chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Let this be known, he said, his voice firm, that respect is earned in the heart before it is shown in the bow. And let it be remembered that even the smallest among us may carry the voice of the divine. Nia lowered her gaze, her chest warm with a mix of relief and disbelief. She had not sought to teach the king anything, yet here she stood, the center of a story that would be told long after she was gone. As she left the great hall, she could feel the shift in the air. Some still looked at her with suspicion, but others now looked as if they saw a different kind of power in her. And for the first time since the throne had fallen, she did not feel entirely afraid of what might come next. The years rolled on, and the memory of the day the throne broke beneath the weight of a simple bough refused to fade. In the village, elders told the tale around evening fires, their voices carrying the awe and lessons that the moment had etched into their hearts. They spoke of Nia, the humble girl who had walked into the palace with nothing but respect in her heart, who had faced humiliation, injustice and suspicion, yet had emerged with her dignity unbroken. Her name, once whispered with pity or scorn, was now spoken with reverence. Children grew up hearing that a bow, when given sincerely, could hold more strength than a sword, and that even the smallest act of truth could shake the tallest pillars of pride. In the palace, the legend took on a regal air. Courtiers, once filled with envy, now recalled the moment with solemn respect, though some still hid their regret behind polite smiles. The king himself commissioned a new throne, not grander than the last but simpler, made not to display his power, but to remind all who sat upon it that authority was a trust, not a weapon. Upon its base was carved a single line in the old script, asterisk, power must bow to humility. Asterisk, whenever visiting dignitaries asked about the unusual design, the king would recount Nia's bow with a tone that was part pride, part warning. Nia, however, did not seek the limelight. She returned to her quiet life, tending to her family's fields, sharing food with neighbors and offering her help where it was needed. Yet the world around her had changed. Strangers began visiting her home, seeking blessings or wisdom, believing her to be touched by the spirits. She never claimed any supernatural gift, but her presence seemed to bring peace to those who came. When young girls in the village faced ridicule or injustice, they would look to her for courage, knowing she had endured worse and walked away with her spirit unbroken. Over time, songs were composed in her honor, soft melodies sung during harvest festivals, where her story was woven into the rhythm of drums and flutes. Her bow was no longer remembered as an act of submission, but as a symbol of unshakable self-respect. In some verses, the cracking of the throne was likened to the breaking of chains that bound people to false hierarchies. In others, it was painted as a divine sign that even the highest seat of power could be humbled by the simplest truth. Generations later, her name became a proverb. Asterisk, bow like Nia, and the world will kneel before your truth. Asterisk, travelers carried it to far-off lands, where it took root in other tongues and other customs, yet always retained the core of its meaning. The day she bowed too low was no longer told as an act of shame, but as the moment a quiet girl revealed that humility, when pure, could hold the force to split stone and timber, and shake the pride of kings. And so, Nia's story lived on, not just as a tale from the past, but as a living reminder whispered in the hearts of all who faced injustice, that even the meekest bow, if given with dignity, could break the mightiest throne.